All right, to finish up today, we're going to take a look at the year 1890 and specifically Frederick Jackson Turner's Frontier Thesis, as it was known. If you've been tracking with what we've been studying all week long, starting with the lecture that I gave prior to heading off to jury duty, I titled this chapter, this whole topic, "The Beginning of the End," or "The End of the Road and the Beginning of a New One." And really, it did kind of coalesce around the year 1890. It's a year that might surprise you as being significant, but it is highly significant. It may surprise you because sometimes that year or that decade is sandwiched between the modern era that starts with 1900 and the Civil War era that ends in 1877, and this is kind of like the black hole of American history. But really, there's a lot going on in the decade that ends the 19th century. Certainly at play, of course, is industrialization and urbanization, the whole Gilded Age, which we have been talking about already, and you should know a fair amount about. But as this chapter 26 has been focused on, there's a lot ending besides what's starting in the new high-tech world that America was finding itself in. And 1890 kind of jumps out as a significant year. The chapter starts with the story of the Native Americans. Their story is certainly ending by the last decade of this century. The Indian Wars, as savage and as brutal as they were, spanned from about 1865 roughly to about 1895. Right in that span of time, the official ending of the centuries-long way of life for Native Americans has been written. The Dawes Severalty Act tries to force them into acting white and ends the reservation system as it was known, or at least tweaks it in a dramatic way. But it wasn't just the Native Americans who were finding their way of life changed. Likewise, of course, farmers were grappling with the changes of technology and government policy and the regulations, the railroading of the railroads as well as corporate America. Certainly they were besieged by dry farming and so many of the other problems that they were finding in the Midwest that were due to the environment and droughts. They were being bombarded by economic pressures both from within the country as well as from without the country. And so they rose up, forming the Grange, which then formed the Alliance, and then that moved into the Populist Party, and they finally got William Jennings Bryan, the boy orator of the Platte. That was his nickname, the Platte being a river that runs through Nebraska. This magnetic personality, this amazing orator, he could wow the crowds. But he had one message, and that was the free and unlimited coinage of silver. Do not crucify us on a cross of gold, in his famous speech. And while that was an effective message to a group of farmers, in reality it wasn't a message that played very well in places like Philadelphia or New York or Boston or Pittsburgh. And America by 1896 had really moved on, and hence McKinley is elected, a man of the East, an established Republican, and William Jennings Bryan and the whole populist movement will have to revert to the shadows and wait for another day. And all of that's happening in the 1890s. Frederick Jackson Turner is a historian, and he will write one of the most critical pieces of historic analysis in the history of American historiography. His so-called Frontier Thesis is certainly worth our attention. In fact, you're going to get a handout, if you don't have it already, that's going to lead you through an excerpt of some of the key parts of that argument. Why is Frederick Jackson Turner so worth noting? Well, first of all, as an AP student, you have to be aware of some of the key historians who, by their force of argument, in a sense, fashioned history for those of us who study it and read it, because of the compelling nature of their argument. Charles Beard, for example, we looked at him back when we studied the Constitution. He made the argument, and it was a good one, that it was the economic motives of the founders, not democracy, not the virtues of a republic, but the economic holdings of these rich white males that compelled them to write the articles, or excuse me, the Constitution the way they did. Well, Frederick Jackson Turner comes along now, and as you've noted in your reading, he writes this thesis based on the census, which says the frontier has closed. Frontier being defined as that unsettled land, the line between wilderness and civilization. Now, why was that significant? Because Turner argued it was the experience from 1600 to 1890 of pushing that line westward. What am I trying to say? Pushing the line westward, and how do they do it? By wrestling with nature, by killing the native tribes that were there, by figuring out ways to farm, figuring out ways to, cut fences or build fences, everything that was necessary to survive in the wilderness or on the frontier is, according to Turner, the one thing that made us uniquely American. Now again, Turner and his argument held sway from 1890s all the way literally into the 1950s. Every historian basically bought his argument, including to a degree our authors. In chapter 26, I'm reading from the red edition, page 611, our authors write 2 paragraphs about Turner. One is very much in favor of his argument, and then one qualifies it a little bit. Let me read the first one to you. It says this: U.S. history cannot be properly understood unless it is viewed in light of the westward moving experience. As Frederick Jackson Turner wrote, quote, American history has been in a large degree the history of the colonization of the Great West, end quote. The story of settling and taming the trans-Mississippi West in the late 19th century was but the last chapter in the saga of colonizing various American Wests, plural, since Columbus's day, from the West Indies to the Chesapeake Shore, from the valleys of the Hudson and Connecticut rivers to the valleys of the Tennessee and Ohio rivers. So basically they, in one paragraph, argue Turner's thesis, which is, from the very beginning, Americans have been moving west into the frontier, and that is what carved our character. That is what made us uniquely American and no longer European. However, it was in the late 1970s, early 80s that a new wave of historians came along, and they began to challenge this thesis that had been the accepted version of American history for, well, over half a century. And the next paragraph in Pageant, if you're following along, says the following: and yet, the Trans-Mississippi West formed a distinct chapter in that saga and retains even to this day much of its uniqueness. Meaning nothing really has changed. Well, why? Because it's there in the West. The Native American peoples made their last and most desperate struggle against colonization. There, most Native Americans live today. There, the West, Anglo culture collided with most directly with Hispanic culture, the historic rival of the Anglo-Americans for dominance in the New World. And it's in the Southwest where the Southwest is still today the most Hispanicized region in America. There, America faced across the Pacific to Asia, and there most Asian Americans dwell today. There, the scale and severity of the environment posed their largest challenges to human ambitions, and there, the environment with its aridity and still magical emptiness continues to mold social and political life and the American imagination as in no other part of the nation. So basically what they're saying is this: Frederick Jackson Turner argued, we conquered the frontier, we made it civilized. And again, most historians bought that argument. Then, again, in the late 1970s, early 80s, some historians, as reflected in this second paragraph, began to say, well, wait a minute. Who says all these people have been conquered? Look, they're still there. There's Asians in the West. There's Hispanics. The natives, though they have shrunk, they're still there. The environment is still a challenge, and on and on. So what I'm going to have you guys do is I want you to read this handout. It is short, but it's weighty stuff. It's college-level material. Welcome to AP. The 7 questions that precede the introduction to it need to be written out on a separate piece of paper. You're going to bring that back with you tomorrow. Trust me, some of this information will be helpful for you as you consider your DBQ question tomorrow. So good luck with it. Good challenge reading it, and make it happen in a good way.